Welcome to a Healthy Push podcast. I'm Shannon Jackson, former anxiety sufferer turned adventure mom and anxiety recovery coach. I struggled with anxiety, panic disorder, and agoraphobia for 15 years. And now I help people to push past the stuff that I used to struggle with. Each week, I'll be sharing real and honest conversations along with actionable and practical steps that you can take to help you push past your anxious thoughts, the symptoms, panic, and fears. Welcome. You're right where you're meant to be. All right, today I have another really special guest with me. His name is Tom, and I'm very excited for you to meet him. I came across his Instagram and was like, ooh, this is so good. I know I have to have him on the podcast. So, Tom Parks is a therapist and specifically an acceptance and commitment therapist and trainer. And we're actually going to talk about this modality, which I'm really excited about. So, before we even go there, Tom, welcome to a Healthy Push podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So let's just start with who's Tom? Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, it's always such a complex question because we're such different people depending on the context of our lives. But professionally, I'm a therapist and trainer, like you said. I am a huge ACT nerd. Um, uh, Outside of work, I love spending time with my wife and my dog and hiking and playing sports. And I'm a musician on the side, so I like doing that. I have my own podcast and called Mentally Flexible, and I really enjoy getting to speak with people in the field and have that as a little side project. Yeah, I don't know. I could go into more or less depth, but
Yeah.
that's a starting point.
Yeah, no, it sounds like we have a little bit in common. It's always really cool to hear people outside of just professionally what they do. And like clearly you're a creative being, which is really awesome. So
Mm,
we're going to talk about ACT. And I know, like you said, you're a big ACT nerd. So I can clearly tell you love it. You're like super committed to it. So let's just start with the very basic because I'm sure people are like, what the heck is it? So, what is ACT, Tom?
yeah. It's funny these moments when uh, I've been on the receiving end of someone telling me it's not ACT, it's ACT. I don't get that hung up on it, but if anyone's interested in diving into the ACT world, typically people call it ACT.
Okay.
And a reason why is a big part of ACT is action. It's learning how
Mm,
to build a rich and meaningful life guided by your values. And because that can be a reason why people struggle doing that is when we try to move towards what matters in life, usually really difficult thoughts and feelings and experiences and memories and sensations show up. And so half of ACT is learning how to really cultivate values driven action. And the other half is learning how to kind of make space for all the distress and discomfort and uncomfortable experiences and stuff under our own skin that shows up along the way.
oh, okay. So there's so much to dig into because when I learned about ACT, I was like honestly blown away. I don't know like if a therapist ever had this like special training, but clearly like this is work that I did when I was
Mm,
in my own therapy journey. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is hugely how I healed. So let's start with first. I'd love to hear you explain what's the difference between ACT and CBT, because I think that might help people really understand what it is a little bit more.
yeah. I'd also at any point welcome and would love to hear a little bit about your journey too and hear about your stuff. And maybe we can talk
Yeah.
about how ACT might have applied in that. I
Yeah.
don't know if I'm the best person to talk too much about the overlaps and differences with CBT because I've never really dove too deep into traditional CBT training. But one difference between CBT and ACT is the way that we understand and work with thoughts. And from my understanding in more traditional CBT, there's work that's done around kind of understanding your thoughts and then trying to notice what are your, I don't even know what language they use in CBT, distorted or maybe dysfunctional or negative or problematic thoughts,
Hmm.
and learning how to challenge them a bit and develop new thoughts that might influence behavior in a more helpful way.
Yeah.
And while there's maybe a little bit of that underlying process happening in ACT, we really try to stay out of labeling thoughts as good or bad or functional or distorted or
Yep.
healthy. And we really aim to instead just get some distance from our thoughts and build awareness of the thoughts that are running through our heads. It's almost like listeners could do this right now, or you could do this, where a lot of times when people come into therapy, their thoughts are like their hand, their fingers, and they're imagine what it's like when your thoughts, if you put your hand right in front of your eyes, what is that like?
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah,
Not comfortable, right? It feels like consuming.
yes. Yeah, where you're sort of seeing the world through your thoughts. In ACT, we call
Mm,
that cognitive fusion, where there's sort of this melding of your awareness and your thoughts, where you don't really have where thoughts are experienced as like literal truth and rules that you must obey. And what we're trying to do is move that hand away. So if you're doing this exercise, you can move your hand kind of out and off to the side. And what's that like when your hand's out there?
yeah. They're less right in your face. You can see more clearly what's actually in front of you. It's not just the thoughts.
Yes. And did the thoughts change at all?
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you don't need to change them, right? It's just getting some distance from them.
yes. And so in ACT, we're trying to work on this process of cognitive diffusion where we learn to get some space from our thoughts and see them as thoughts, see them as chatter running through our heads.
Mhm.
And then from that place, instead of trying to understand what's good or bad about your thoughts, we move towards a place of what thoughts are helpful or unhelpful in moving us towards what matters in life.
Mhm.
And so we don't in ACT, we don't move towards debating thoughts or figuring out what's true or false. We move towards building awareness of our thoughts and then using the ones that are helpful that move us towards our values and letting the ones that are unhelpful sort of just kind of be there and let them arise and fall naturally instead of trying to control them. And so I think in traditional CBT, there'd be a different stance on that. There might be some I've heard describe it as like, so your hand starts in front of your eyes. Uh, you get some distance from it to see which ones are good or bad, and you replace them with maybe better ones, and then you move your hand back
Yeah.
in front of your eyes. And
Yeah.
I don't want to put that down. I'm sure that there obviously is evidence that that can help people, but in ACT, we just approach it differently.
It's so interesting, of course, because I'm just thinking of my own journey, and I work with a lot of people who are struggling with like severe anxiety, right? Panic, agoraphobia. And I think what's really challenging for a lot of people who are struggling with anxiety disorders is that they're very analytical. They're like very good at problem solving and like using those analyzing skills. But what I find, and especially in people who have done a lot of CBT work, is that that sort of is the opposite of being helpful for them because they're always analyzing like, am I doing this right? Like, am I challenging my thoughts in the most helpful way? Like, am I, can I change my thoughts? Like, is there a right way to do it? And
Yes.
you can get so stuck in that so very
Yes.
quickly, and that's why I love ACT because it's like, that's not what we're trying to do here. We are just trying to let the thoughts be, have an awareness of them, let them be, but, like, not go down the rabbit holes of analyzing and trying to change and challenge them, and I something I hear a lot, right, is people will say, well, my therapist said to me, and this is not a knock against therapists at all, but my therapist said to me, well, has it ever happened before? This said fear, whatever it is, like, I'm afraid that I'm going to panic and pass out. And, they'll get that challenging question that I think is very CBT. Well, has it ever happened before? And I'm like, oh my gosh. It's just not helpful because I'm
Mm,
like, it doesn't matter whether it's happened before or not. Anxiety is not very logical. It's not like you're just going to say, well, it's never happened before. So therefore, we don't need to worry about it and we can just on with it. Like, we don't need to have these thoughts anymore. It's just like
yes.
dropping that. We don't need to try to figure out our thoughts. We don't need to dig into them.
Yes. Yeah. The trap of the problem solving mind is so difficult, so easy to get into and so hard to get out of. It's like falling in quicksand. And that comes from a functional place in our evolutionary history that our ability to problem solve was something that was really functional for us in a world filled with threats.
Mm.
And it still works now, where if you touch a hot pan on the stove and you realize that that's dangerous and that hurts, your mind can guide you towards a place where you just never do that again. Avoid that for the rest of your life. And that's a helpful thing. But what
Hmm.
happens, a root of suffering from an ACT perspective, is that type of problem solving approach gets turned inwards on our own thoughts and feelings and sensations. And people end up in these battles under their own skin with stuff that is never going to go away. I mean, from an emotional level, we're meant to have the full range of emotions. And so if your mind targets anxiety or sadness or grief or shame as a problem to be solved or something to avoid, your life more and more gets centered around struggling with this
Mm.
part of you that is never going to go away. And you're just going to get more stuck in it, or you're going to get so good at skirting around it and avoiding it that your life starts to get really small, because a lot of the things that matter to us bring on difficult emotions. And
Hmm.
from a cognitive level, once a thought is in your head, it's in there. There is no delete button in your mind. And anyone who struggles with anxiety or OCD or panic knows what it's like to have a new difficult thought pop up and want so badly to get away from it and want it to go away, and only to realize that it only gets more central and stronger the more that you do that.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Like, you could think of, we can put a new thought in listeners' heads right now. Like, think of
And everyone's like, please don't do it, Tom. Please don't do this.
no, I won't do something distressing. Like, all right, so I have a golden retriever. Picture a golden retriever wearing a sombrero hat, um, playing soccer. Okay, so see if you can put that in your head. A golden retriever and a sombrero hat playing soccer. All right, now that that's in your head, I will give you $1 million if you can delete it from your head.
Ah.
Try right now. I'll give you a little few moments. Get it out of your head. You realize, obviously, is once something's in your mind, there is no delete button.
Hmm.
And for anyone struggling with anxiety or OCD or panic or any of these, we just kind of know what that game is like. The more that you try to go down that road, it's just an unwinnable game inside of your own head. So
Yeah.
I know I just ranted a little bit, but
No, that was so good. And you feel like, I think a place that a lot of people go to, and a place that I used to go to, was, oh no, I'm having this new, what seemed like scarier thought, but really it wasn't. It was just like a new and different take on it. But it was like this new scary thought, and this means that I'm getting worse. And
yes,
therefore, yes, I need to get a hold of this. Like, I need to make this go away. I shouldn't be thinking this. I can't be thinking this. This causes me so much distress. Delete, delete, delete. And yeah, you can't. And you just end up feeding it so much. And, very specific, uh, I mean, a couple I can think of. Of course, this happened for me relating to panic. It was like, what if you panic? What if you pass out? This is like my go to always. And it was
hmm
like I couldn't ever turn it off. And of course, I tried. I was like always fighting it. And another one, with my anxiety, always experienced a lot of digestive issues. And so I
hmm
had this constant fear that like I was going to need to go to the bathroom and there wouldn't be a place to go to the bathroom. And it
hmm
was like these thoughts, they would shift and just change and become different. And I felt like scarier. And of course, I feel like your normal human reaction to the thoughts is get rid of it. Like, I can't deal. Like, I cannot handle having these thoughts. And I think what's so beautiful about ACT is it's like that's not what we're going to try to do. We need to actually recognize that this is what you're trying to do, right? This is part of it, like recognizing you are trying to fight, you are trying to get rid of. And of course, it makes sense that you're trying to, because it's uncomfortable. The thoughts bring very uncomfortable things with them. But continuing to fight and try to get rid of is just like feeding it and
yes.
causing so much. I always felt like, what more? Like, is there ever a stopping point? And I didn't feel like there was ever a stopping point. Like, it would always morph and become something bigger and more ugh.
Totally. Well, it sounds like something that a process you've gone through is something I've gone through and I help clients go through. It's being able to, a lot of times when people come into therapy, they're really caught in the grips of what we call experiential avoidance, where a lot of their life is being guided by almost like a control agenda, spending a lot of time trying to control what's happening under our own skins or happening in our lives, primarily what's happening under our own skin, the kind of thoughts that we're having, the feelings, the sensations, the memories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like more and more of your time is being spent in a tug of war with your own inner world. And what we try to pivot into from an ACT perspective is moving out of a control agenda and into an acceptance agenda. And some people don't like that word acceptance. And
Yeah.
so another word people might like is a willingness agenda. It's like we're trying to move away from control and into a willingness to experience whatever shows up inside of us at any given moment. It's like you could imagine that we're all in tune with this one knob on your chest, and it's your distress knob. And so when something challenging shows up under our own skin, that distress knob goes up. And our mind's first instinct is to figure out, how do I turn this knob back down? And there's a lot of good ways to do that in the short term. You could drink, you could cancel plans, you can
Mm-hmm.
distract yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of things that work in the short term, but I think we all know the more you rely on those things in the short term, it only amplifies that underlying process that's going on. And so what I work on with clients from an ACT perspective is learning how to understand and appreciate that distress and hold it with some compassion, but focus more on this other knob that you've forgotten about, which is your willingness knob. And so, can we go on a journey together where we work on increasing our willingness to experience the distress whenever it shows up instead of trying to control it? That's sort of a core thing that we're doing from an ACT perspective.
Mm-hmm. Ugh. Just like I remember all this stuff in my journey, and I'm just like, it was so hard doing this work. But I always say, right, you have to choose the hard that's actually going to get you to where you want to be. And like, it was so hard for me to, it really feels like you're just leaving yourself so entirely exposed to
Yes.
anxiety. Like, I am just going to actually let this come along. I'm going to let it be here. I'm going to like let the thoughts, the feelings, and we'll just see. And like that willingness, right? I know it's so hard. I'm glad you used that term because I know a lot of people struggle with acceptance, just that term, I think. And it's just, it really truly is. And I say this is work that I even do now. I'm sure you do this, right? We always have to sort of work on increasing our willingness
Hmm.
to face like uncomfortable things. It's not just a, anxiety recovery specific thing. Um, I'm interested. I know, of course, ACT can be used for many different things. You mentioned, of course, with I feel like really tough emotions like anxiety, but also like with grief. I imagine this is something that comes in really handy when somebody's struggling with grief. Are there
Hmm.
other like um, things that you use ACT for with clients?
Yeah. Me personally, a lot of my caseload, I work with a lot of people struggling with anxiety, OCD, umbrella ish
Hmm.
challenges. The cool thing about ACT, though, is it's a transdiagnostic approach. And if people don't know what that means, it means it sort of targets, it's not made for any individual specific diagnosis or syndrome. We don't really
Mm-hmm.
use that language and that framework in ACT, because ACT focuses more on the underlying processes that lead to suffering or that lead to flourishing that are common across all challenges. And so if you look up ACT for whatever the challenge is, it's being used for literally everything. It's being used in professional sports. It's being used with the World Health Organization in refugee camps. It's being used for musicians. It's being used for everything, because I could sort of take us through those. There's 6 processes that we're working on in ACT that are kind of core and fundamental to most human challenges. And so we've already touched on a bunch here today. One is just the way we relate to our own thoughts. Like the
Hmm.
more that we are sort of fused with our thoughts and seeing the world through them, the more that challenges we tend to face, and the more that we can distance ourselves from our thoughts and see them as thoughts and use what's helpful and leave the rest, the more we're going to kind of move freely in the world and not be so driven by our mind's commands. There's the way we relate to what we just talked about. The more that we tend to avoid our own emotions and sensations going on under our own skin, the more challenges we face, and the more that we're willing to experience those compassionately, the usually the more fully we can show up in our lives. Then there's how much present moment awareness do we have? Like
Mm.
how much can we actually be here right now in this moment, flexibly and fluidly? Because flexibly and focused. Uh, Flexibly without the focus is sort of kind of what you might see in what we'd call ADHD. It's a lot of like bouncing around to different things in the present moment. And focused without the flexibility is like a kid playing video games that's so locked in that the house
Mm.
could be on fire and they're not going to notice. So
Right.
the ability to sort of be here right now, focused and flexibly, is another one, because people tend to struggle when there's an over dominance of being in the past and future in our minds. I
Mm.
think we can all relate to that, right? It's like there's some value in going to the past to learn from our experiences and process, but too much of that is not helpful. And going into the future to be able to plan and organize our lives and set goals is helpful, but too much of that is also not helpful. So finding this balance between primarily showing up in the here and now and using the past and future consciously is a process we work on.
Mm-hmm.
Another one in ACT is kind of a little bit harder to explain, but the way I understand it is the way that we identify inside. And one way people tend to identify that causes challenges is an over identification with the stories about ourselves, like our conceptualized self, like I'm a bad person, or I'm not smart, or I'm not likable, or on the other end, I'm a good person, or I'm the best, or I'm, whatever it is.
Mm.
The more that we are sort of fused and caught up in those stories and parts of our identities in our heads, the more we struggle because they sort of distort how clearly we can understand ourselves in the world. And so what we're trying to work on in ACT is learning how to sort of reconnect with this more spiritual witnessing awareness part of ourselves, the sort of light behind it all that is none of those things or all of those things, depending on
Mm.
which way you look at it, that just is.
Yeah.
That our sort of awareness, learning how to identify more with that awareness inside than the individual parts that we tell ourselves. There's some like cool overlap with IFS there, I think.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah. And then the last two parts of ACT are more those behavioral parts. It's learning how to get in touch with what really matters to us. We call them values in ACT, but it's really just like what really matters to us. How do we want to show up in the world? And this
Mm.
is different than goals because our values are things that are never accomplished. You can never
Mm.
fully achieve your goals. So, like, maybe I have a goal of seeing 25 clients a week, but my value under that is like helping people and showing up and being curious and present with other people and compassionate. And those things are never going to end. And so they're sort of the soil that then our values grow out of. And the last part is just how we actually put that into practice, committed action. How do we actually commit to behaviors that are guided by our values? And in ACT, we look at all 6 of those processes through a model of like the ACT hexaflex.
Mm-hmm.
And from a therapist point of view, every time I'm working with a client, I am, it's almost like this little game where we're dancing around those 6 processes and fluidly like weaving them all together to increase as a whole what we call psychological flexibility.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much goodness. I am so intrigued. I'm thinking when you do this work with clients, of course, I love the value based stuff there because I feel like there's so much there that people often have a ton of goals, right? Like, I want to be able to get back in the car and start driving, and I want to be able to da, da, da. And I think it can be so much more helpful, right, to really define what are my values and using that to help you work toward getting your life back in a way that also feels good and is motivating for you and is not just like we're just taking these steps to check them off the box and hopefully recover. So I'm curious with ACT, I assume part of the values work is creating these shifts, like the behavior changes in a way that's like kind of like exposure work. Am I on the right path here or no?
Maybe just say a little bit more, like give me a double click on
Yeah.
that for me.
Yeah. I know I was like a little bit going off on a rambling
No, it's okay.
tangent.
There's something important in there. I just want to really understand what
Yeah.
you're saying.
I'm curious. Okay. So, specifically, say you have a client that you're working with that is struggling with an anxiety disorder, like a panic disorder or panic disorder, and they're really struggling to do a lot of just day to day things. Do
Hmm.
you use ACT in a way to help them do exposure type work
Mm-hmm.
using these things within ACT?
Totally. Yes. 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 Great question. Um, yeah, because whether it's for a panic disorder or any other challenge that I'm working with a client, all this stuff we were talking about before about being willing to feel your own pain or discomfort or anxiety and like be aware and allow your difficult thoughts. Why the heck would anybody do that
Right.
if it wasn't for that opening up other opportunities? And so all of that, like being willing to experience our discomfort, is in the service of what matters. Like that's the fuel that allows us to do those things.
Hmm.
And so yeah, when it comes to exposure work, the more that it can be tied to what actually matters to a person, the more buy-in that there's going to be. It's like values and ACT is sort of the difference between, imagine it's like a really, really cold, you're from Maine, right? I think I read
Yeah.
that. All right. So the water's probably still really cold right now, right?
Always, all year
Yes.
round.
Yes, I'm from Connecticut, so it's
Yeah, you
you
know.
know, similar-ish. Yeah. So imagine that you were going to just go swim toward into the middle of a lake right now in Maine and swim back. Think about how like unpleasant and cold and much you wouldn't want to do that, right?
Hmm.
Okay. Now think about that same behavior, but I don't want to, hopefully this is okay to say that, but you have a child, right?
Yep.
Okay. What if your child was out there and really needed you to go save her or him or
In
them?
in a split second, wouldn't even think about it.
Yes. Okay. Same behavior, but what's different about that?
Oh, I have something that's really important to me, a big motivating factor in why I would do it.
Is any of the discomfort of the coldness going to go away throughout that process?
Oh, no, it would be awful.
Yes. But that willingness to experience it just skyrockets.
Yeah.
Now, I know that's an extreme
Right, I
example,
was gonna say, "You're
but
throwing my child out in the middle of a lake, Tom, come on." I'm okay with it, she's a great swimmer.
I know that that's an extreme example, but I use that to just sort of really drive the point home that that same dynamic is what we're working on. It's like, what is available to us in the present moment that really matters to you, that you would rather put your attention and your focus and life energy towards, that is going to allow our willingness to have the discomfort that's with us there. And it happens in small ways too. Like, I've struggled with anxiety a lot throughout my life. And so like on a morning like this where I'm gonna be on a podcast, from the moment I wake up, my anxiety kicks in. It's, the like, oh man, like how this today, like I hope it's gonna go well. My mind starts chattering, the anxiety starts coming up. And through the work that I've been able to do, I'm not perfect with it, but most of the time now I can just like, oh, hello, anxiety, welcome. I see you. Hello, mind telling me not to mess up and that uh, maybe you should prepare more, like all this stuff. I see you. Thanks for trying to like help me out. But I'm just going to kind of feel this and be with these thoughts right now. And instead use my morning focusing on what matters to me, which is doing kind of like my routine, spending time with my dog, like talking with my wife before she leaves, actually being present with my workout.
Mm.
And maybe in the past, before I did ACT, the moment that that anxiety popped up, I would have wanted to get away from it so badly that my mind's options would have been spend the 2 hours before the podcast over preparing
Yep.
or cancel it, you know?
Yep.
Like those would be the mind solutions to that if I wasn't willing to feel it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I like everything that you've shared is so relatable. I think, I'm curious because I know people that are listening are like, okay, you've personally struggled. Do you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about personally how you've struggled with anxiety? Because I think that's so helpful for people to hear.
Oh yeah, I mean, how much time you got?
We have
um,
all the time. No, roughly 10 minutes, Tom. Can you
yeah.
shorten it, abbreviate it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to begin. It's like, I think I've always just been leaned on the anxious side since I was really
Mhm.
young. And I think it wasn't until my early ish mid 20s that I really understood it and found more helpful ways to work with it. And what is cool now is a lot of all that same anxiety stuff is still there. It's just my work on not struggling with it and focusing more on building things around it. Like my life has just gotten so much more richer around it that that
Mhm.
same stuff is there, but there's so much more. Uh,
Mhm.
and I know I'm not trying to move away, like, or I don't even know where to go with this. Like it shows up now still. Like I give trainings, I give ACT trainings, and every time I've probably not specifically ACT trainings, but I've probably given 50 trainings around the country at this point over the past 5 years. But every time those same feelings creep up the week before and the same kinds of thoughts. And the morning of, it builds and builds and builds until I get about to the first break. And then it kind of naturally goes down. But
Mhm.
when I was first starting to do this, I mean, I saw that as such a problem that needed to be solved and such a like yeah, such a problem with me instead of just part of what it means to be a human when you do something that matters to you.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're like, "This is who I am. I'm just an anxious person, like, there's something wrong with me. I can't be this way. I don't wanna be this way." And it's like, well, there is so much that's normal and makes sense about your experience, like, especially, right, giving talks and being in all these new places and situations and being put on the spot, and, like, I always say to people so much with different things that they'll share, I'm like, can we pause for a minute? Does that make sense that anxiety showed up? Does it make sense that
Hmm.
maybe even experienced the panic attack? Instead of just looking at everything, every time anxiety pops up as being problematic, it's like that's the
Yes.
problem. And that's what
Yes.
I didn't realize for so long was like literally it was a friend that said to me, Shannon, I think it's so problematic because you're always trying to fight it. And I was like, what? Like, what do you
Mm,
mean? And I remember I took that in and I was like, you're right. You're right. But like, I always felt like I have to fight this sort of side of me because similar to you, you know, was anxious from a very young age. And I always saw that as being problematic rather than giving myself some grace, right? Letting myself be human and acknowledging a lot of times when anxiety popped up, even as a young kid, it made a heck of a lot of sense why it popped up. So,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing some of that. Yeah. And it's just such a shame that we are all sort of conditioned, not all of us, but many of us are conditioned to conceal these parts of us. And
Mhm.
so everyone's kind of walking around silently suffering in their own little bubble,
Right?
pretending that they're the only ones. But the truth is everybody struggles with mental health stuff. There really isn't, that's a cool thing about ACT is traditional Western psychology is founded on this assumption that, you know, difficult thoughts and feelings and suffering is a sign of pathology or a sign of not being normal. Um,
Yep.
But ACT is more grounded in, it's like we all suffer. It's part of being human. We all hurt. And a lot of our suffering is stuff outside of our control. And a lot of our suffering is stuff we choose to bring on. You're a parent. How much more anxiety do you have now having a child than you did before? Like there's so much more to worry about. Or if you're a
Yeah.
dog parent, like, and that's part of it, is just when things matter to us, we're going to get anxious about it, because once you know, like, this kind of goes into the weeds of how our mind works, but you can't have something you care about without your mind also being aware of losing it. Those two things go together. They're two
Mm.
sides of the same coin. And so the more you actually build things that matter to you, the more you also build the flip side of that, which is like loss and things going wrong. And so
Mm.
your choices are either to accept that and go out and let what matters to you steer the ship and take along all that stuff that comes with it, or keep your life really small to protect against that.
Yep. Literally, it's so interesting because people will say to me, I struggled with panic and agoraphobia for 15 years. Like it was absolutely terrible. And people said, were you afraid to become a parent? And I'm always very honest. I'm like, I didn't make the decision. It just happened. And thank God it happened the way it did, because I probably would have never made the decision. But honestly, it was so interesting how becoming a mom really shifted something in me that I learned in my anxiety recovery journey, which was, yes, there is a lot to worry about, right? There is a lot. The stakes are sort of really high, but that's even more of a reason to be more present and just connected. And so
Yes.
when I had my daughter, it was like I didn't experience the anxiety that maybe people would have anticipated, or maybe I maybe was bracing myself a little bit for. It was just like, oh no, you are going to be as present and connected as possible because you
Mm.
have a very good reason to be. And so, yeah, that was an incredible like shift for me. And my husband gets upset sometimes because he's just like, I swear you went the other way. Like you recovered and you don't worry, you don't plan, you don't. And I'm like, yeah, of course I still have,
Yes.
anxiety. It still pops up, but now I know, it's a very different relationship with it than it used to be.
Yes. Well, it really clarified in this direct and sincere way what's important for you to focus on. And
Yeah.
I resonate with that so much too, with, my relationship with my wife and, with my dog and close friends. And especially even as a therapist, that same thing you talked about shows up for me every time I sit with a client, because this client is taking giving me this unique privilege to be brought inside of this really important world of theirs. And so when I'm sitting in the room with the client, it's like that's the only thing that matters to me, is for
Yeah.
me to be able to show up fully as a conscious human being and be present and be curious and be like a big oak tree just sitting in the ground that's going to be there and be sturdy for them. And this is and using ACT on myself, and that's a big part of the ACT model, is like ACT therapists doing this stuff themselves, because you can only help a client with those processes to the extent that you do it themselves. Because if you're
Mm.
sitting there caught up in what you're going to have for lunch and
Right.
like, or running away from your own discomfort about something that they just said, or not connected to why you do the work, it's kind of, there's this like weird hypocrisy to the work. And not that I'm perfect with it, and you don't need to be perfect, but I think you need to maybe be earnest in your kind of your parallel journey with the client on it. And so when I'm sitting there and I'm really focused and present, and I get a difficult thought that pops up, like, did I just say the wrong thing? I need, my work is be like to notice that thought, allow it to be there.
Hmm.
And then maybe it's helpful to share that with the client. Like, hey, I noticed when I said that, I had this thought pop up that might not have been helpful. Like, I just want to share kind of what's going on with me. What are your thoughts with that? Or if I get an uncomfortable feeling that's showing up,
Dang.
instead of using my time talking myself out of it for the session, I acknowledge it and I be with it and I let it move through me. And it's this thing that can happen while you're also still there in the moment. And yeah, the whole time I'm just grounded in like what matters most to me is just, yeah, I don't want to be repetitive, but just being present, curious, open, honest, real, and those are like in the driver's seat, and all the uncomfortable thoughts and feelings are passengers in the car on that session.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm sure people are sitting back thinking, hey, Tom, can you be my therapist? Honestly, I mean, really, I've had so many conversations with people, right? But we talk about, different modalities and different ways of approaching your struggles. And I love IFS and, learning more about ACT. I think these two modalities are so beautiful and you've just given it so much justice. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing everything that you have and allowing us to learn a little bit more about Tom. So if people want to find and connect with you and get some support from you, where can they find you?
Well, thanks for all those kind words. And it was really cool connecting with you too. And I appreciate your openness and vulnerability. And I love the kind of vibe we had of that it was more of a conversation. And
Yeah.
it was great talking to you. That time flew by.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, people could find me on Instagram at Mentally Flexible. And that's the name of my podcast. So if you're interested in some of this ACT stuff, look up Mentally Flexible. And I'm sure you could find an episode that resonates with your challenges or what you're interested in. Some of it is more geared towards therapists, and others are going to be just great for anyone to listen to.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
I love that, by the way, because I noticed a lot of people who listen to your podcast are therapists, and I think it's amazing that you're helping to educate and train people on this because it is so immensely helpful. So you're doing great stuff.
Oh, thanks. Well, there's a Ram Dass quote I love, if anyone knows Ram Dass, and he says, we're all walking each other home. And
Mm,
so we're all going to the same
yep.
place, particularly in the ACT world, but I think all of us in the helping profession. And I have been so inspired and guided by people that have been doing this long before me. And it's cool to be now part of the process of maybe inspiring some other people. And so ACT is such an open source community based thing that none of this is, about me, or I'm not adding anything necessarily that unique except my perspective on the
Yeah.
thing. And so
Yeah.
just there's a lot of great people. If you're interested in ACT, start by pick up a copy of The Happiness Trap by Dr. Russ Harris. He's one of like the most accessible and well spoken and easy to like get into people in the ACT world. Read The Happiness Trap. I think you'd really like that.
Okay, so cool. It's now on my list, and I'm sure on a lot of people's lists too.
Well,
All right, thanks, Tom. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Healthy Push. If you want more, head on over to ahealthypush.com for the show notes and lots more tips, tools, and inspiration that will support your recovery. And if you're hoping for me to cover a certain topic, be sure to join my Instagram community at A Healthy Push and let me know in the comments what you want to hear next.